Before we get into the story, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Are you tuning in from Los Angeles, Dallas, or maybe somewhere warm like South Carolina? And while you're thinking about that, don't forget to subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the next story. Just trust me on this one, you'll want to stay until the end. You know how some days feel so ordinary you barely notice them while they're happening? That morning, I had no clue it would turn into something I'd remember for a long time. I was in the supply closet at work, crouched between dusty cartons and forgotten office junk, trying to make sense of months of clutter. The air smelled like cardboard and lemon cleaner, a mix that always made me feel weirdly productive and a little nostalgic. My hair was tied back, sleeves pushed up, and I was humming under my breath just to keep the task from swallowing me whole. I had just pulled a stack of old binders from the top shelf when I heard the door click open. At first, I assumed it was an intern, but no, it was him, Mr. Barrett, my boss. He rarely came back here. Most people didn't even remember this little room existed unless they needed something urgent. My heart jumped in that embarrassing way it does when you're caught off guard, half self-conscious and half something I couldn't quite name. "Morning, Dana," he said, and his voice was unusually gentle. He didn't step in with his usual brisk energy, the kind that makes you sit up straighter without meaning to. Instead, he lingered by the doorway, almost hesitant, like he'd walked into a different world than the rest of the office. "Good morning, Mr. Barrett," I replied, forcing my voice to sound steady even though my hands were still wrestling. With a stubborn box of ledgers, he moved closer, careful not to bump the stacks around us, and that's when I noticed something different in his face, something softer, more open than I'd ever seen during meetings or quick hallway exchanges. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I just wanted to check on you back here." The pause that followed felt oddly intimate in such a cramped, dim little space. I swallowed, trying to keep everything professional, even though the air felt charged with something unexpected. "I'm fine," I said, "just trying to get this mess under control." He nodded, and for a moment we simply stood there surrounded by old paper and forgotten office history. Then, quietly, he said something that made me freeze mid-motion. "I've always respected how you handle things, Dana. You make this place feel looked after." It didn't sound like the kind of compliment a boss tosses out to keep morale up. It sounded like recognition, real respect. And it hit me deeper than it should have. I felt a rush of mixed emotions, gratitude, surprise, and a curiosity that made my chest tighten. For a long second, we just looked at each other, and I realized this wasn't the usual work interaction. Something about the dusty sunbeam through the tiny window, the floating specks in the light, made it feel like the whole world had narrowed to that room. And in that moment, I understood the day wasn't going to feel ordinary anymore. After he left the closet, I tried to go back to sorting boxes, but it was impossible to focus completely. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about the way he looked at me, not in a way that felt inappropriate, but in a way that made my thoughts drift. There was a steadiness in his presence, like standing near a small fire in winter warm, without demanding anything from you. I started noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way he folded his hands behind his back when he was thinking. The small smile that reached his eyes even when he was silent. The way his voice softened when he asked how long I thought the organizing project would take. I'd always respected him as a boss, but that day I saw him as something more complicated, more human. I didn't realize it was this chaotic back here, he'd said, bending to pick up a stray folder. His fingers brushed mine when he handed it to me, and for a second the world shrank down to that tiny contact. "You'd be amazed what people dump in here," I'd replied with a quick laugh, trying to hide the flutter in my stomach. He chuckled, low and comfortable, and it made me smile more naturally than I had in weeks. I guess I should come back here more often, he'd said. Then, after a pause that felt like a choice, he added, not just to see the mess, but to see you. The words landed gently, no pressure, no demand, just honesty. And I realized I wasn't afraid of honesty. I was drawn to it later that afternoon, while I reached for another box. He stepped closer, never crowding, just close enough that I felt the reality of him there. The sunlight caught the silver at his temples and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, lines that looked less like age and more like experience. For the first time, I really looked at him. Not my boss, not the man who signed off on schedules. Just a person with layers I hadn't bothered to imagine. Dana, he said quietly, almost like he was thinking out loud, do you ever feel like there's more to all of this than just work? I paused, staring at shelves and boxes, and then back at him. Yeah, I admitted. Sometimes it feels like we're all just moving papers around and missing what matters. He nodded, slow. Exactly. And I think we forget to appreciate the people who actually keep things running until they're right in front of us. We stood there in silence, and for once it didn't feel awkward. It felt full, like a mutual understanding had formed without either of us forcing it. When he finally turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. I don't usually speak like this at work, he said, eyes holding mine, but I'm glad I came back here today. My throat tightened. Me too, I whispered, and the words felt heavier than they should have. When the door closed behind him, I leaned back against a stack of boxes, heart still racing. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the rhythm of my days had changed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet anticipation that life could still surprise me in the most ordinary places. The next few days felt different, even though nothing obvious changed. The office still ran like it always did, emails, meetings, deadlines, the same fluorescent hung overhead. But I noticed I kept replaying that moment in the supply closet like a song stuck in my head. Every time I saw Mr. Barrett in the hallway or near my desk, my pulse picked up, and I caught myself searching his expression for a sign that he remembered it too. Then one afternoon, something shifted again. I was back in the storage area, this time sorting boxes of old decorations and outdated promotional materials, when I heard the soft click of the door. I froze for a second, a strange blend of nerves, an anticipation rising in me. And there he was again, standing there with a folder in his hand, looking almost unsure whether he should step inside. Hi, Dana, he said softly. His tone felt warmer this time, more personal, like he was speaking to me instead of at me. Hi, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Back again? He gave a faint smile and stepped closer. I needed to check on something, he said, and I was hoping we could talk for a minute. He glanced around at the clutter, the uneven stacks, the strip of sunlight through the window, then back to me. Do you have a moment? I nodded, and suddenly the room felt smaller and safer, like it had folded itself around us to make space for something quiet and real. He handed me the folder and lingered, just long enough that his fingers brushed mine again. It was a tiny touch, but it landed like a spark. And then we started talking, not about deadlines, not about office politics, not about the usual safe topics. We talked about life. He told me about growing up with a strict father, about the pressure he carried, about the way success can feel lonely when nobody really knows you. And without planning to, I opened up too. I talked about the years I'd spent being dependable, about how easy it was to disappear behind confidence, and how sometimes I went home and realized I hadn't truly laughed all day. There was gentle humor, and there were silences that felt comfortable instead of strained. For a while, it felt like the rest of the office had faded out completely in that dim little room, and I could hear him breathing, his breath getting louder. I realized I hadn't really I felt something I didn't expect to feel at work. Trust. Trust that I could be honest without being judged. Trust that this wasn't just curiosity or a flattering moment, but something human and steady. At one point, he leaned back against the shelf and looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Dana," he said softly, "I know this is unusual, but I feel like I've known you longer than we've really talked." I swallowed, trying to shape what I was feeling into words. "I feel that too," I admitted. "It's unexpected, but it doesn't feel wrong." He nodded, and something passed between us in agreement without pressure. No rush, no dramatic leap, just recognition. When he left that day, he didn't make promises out loud. He didn't have to. The lingering glance at the doorway said enough. Whatever had started here wasn't ending with a simple goodbye. I sat down on the edge of a box after he left, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as an employee, not as a role, not as the person who always handles it, but as a whole person. And it hit me how strange it was that the most meaningful moment I'd had in so long happened between shelves of dusty supplies. Sometimes life doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a place you barely notice, with a person you thought you already understood. And I realized with a kind of calm wonder that maybe my life still had surprises. Left in it, days passed, and the quiet tension between us settled into something strangely comforting. I began to notice the small gestures, him pausing by my desk with an easy smile, the way he'd ask how the storage room was coming along, the subtle encouragement in his voice when I spoke. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't reckless. It was steady, and because it was steady, it felt real. One evening, after most of the office had emptied out and the building felt softer, quieter, I found myself back in the storage room again, finishing the last few boxes. I heard the familiar click of the door and looked up. He was there, hands in his pockets, calm in a way that made my chest tighten the best possible way. "Dana," he said quietly. He didn't rush to explain. His presence already carried. "Meaning, I just wanted to thank you," he said, "for being yourself, for what you do here. I don't think I've ever appreciated someone in this building the way I appreciate you, warmth spread through me." "You don't have to say that," I replied, even though my voice trembled a little, "but I'm glad you did." He took a slow step closer, deliberate, giving me room to meet him halfway. "I've realized something," he said, and his voice was steady but tender. "Life is short, and sometimes we wait too long to admit what matters." "I don't want to." "Wait." The words hung in the air, soft and sincere, and I felt emotion rise so fast I couldn't stop it. I nodded. "I don't want to wait either." For a moment, we just stood there, letting the dusty light, the quiet room, the faint scent of old paper witness what was happening. There was no dramatic confession, no grand gesture, just honesty, respect, and two people acknowledging something that had grown from quiet professionalism into something deeply human. We talked a little longer about the future, about what we wanted, about fears we didn't usually say out loud. And in that small, unremarkable storage room, I realized something simple. The heart of life hides in unexpected corners. What began as an ordinary task organizing boxes had turned into a reminder that connection can find you anywhere, and sometimes it arrives when you least expect it. When he finally stepped away, he paused at the door, looked back, then smiled a smile that held gratitude, admiration, and something tender I'd never seen on him in the conference room. I smiled back, heart full, knowing that the world outside was the same, but something inside me was send single quotes to thoughts sitting back on a box. I let myself breathe. I let myself feel the calm, the warmth, the quiet satisfaction of being seen. It reminded me that no matter your age, no matter how routine life becomes, There is always room for something meaningful to begin. Sometimes it starts with a simple sentence. Sometimes it starts with a moment you almost miss. And as I switched off the light and pulled the storage room door closed behind me, I couldn't stop myself from smiling because I wasn't walking out with just a clean closet. I was walking out with the quiet certainty that this was the beginning of something new, something steady and something real.